coronavirus pandemic is ravaging demand and with it, the global economy. Many Chinese factories are grappling with slashed or canceled overseas orders, even as some countries start to reopen. China's exports rebounded in April, but many warn the strength is unlikely to last as the pandemic still continues to depress global consumer demand. So how serious is the problem for Chinese factories and the world? How soon will be global demand picking up? And how will the integrity and efficiency of supply chain be affected? To talk about these issues and more, I'm joined by Hong Hao, Chief Strategist, the Bank of Communications in Hong Kong, Jake Parker, Senior Vice President of China Operations for the USChina Business Council, and Charlotte Ruhl, Vice President of EU Chamber of Commerce in China. That is our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Zhou Yue. So, the factory output has been dropping, but because of a slow demand. Hong Hao, let me start with you. Many Chinese factories are still grappling with canceled overseas orders after reopening. As we understand, the global demand stays tepid. How big is a problem is this?
Yeah, well, I think from the April export numbers, you're not going to see a huge problem, because people are rushing through the orders that came in the first quarter. And because of the February and March, basically China as a country shut down. So I think now maybe, maybe people are just making up for lost times. But I think after April, though, going into the second quarter, because overseas economies are basically shut down. So I think orders starting to dwindle or even disappearing going into the second quarter. And I think the magnitude of it, can only be felt, in May. I think once we get the production number and also the export number in May, we're probably going to see the real picture. But I think if you look at the PMI index, if you look at the new export order sub-index, it's already sort of showing signs of decline.
And do you think it is simply because of the drawing down of demand? Also, there are factors of transport and logistics. What are the major reasons?
I would say it's both. Even the foreign demands are falling, and also even if you produce the products that fits to the order, it's very difficult to ship it out. So I would say that it's a little bit of both, and I think the situation is continuing into the second quarter.
And Charlotte, what is your reading of the trade picture between January and April, especially between Europe and China?
It's always difficult to make analysis on this period, and especially to draw perspective. I would say that actually we saw huge drops, as you know, in exports in January to March, and April was quite surprising with a plus 3.5% increase in terms of exports. So that's anyway a positive signal, so we should take it as it is. In terms of impacting the export to the EU, and that's true, by the way, also for the US, it doesn't come really as a surprise, because actually those areas were more hardly hit by the pandemic, more affected by the shutdown also. And the number may be a bit inflated in terms of export. So let me explain that a little bit. Actually, there were some orders that were late, so they had to be delivered. So there is an effect on imports. And we see also companies that are stockpiling supplies in order to support their markets back home. So that could create that kind of effect as well.
So it's a false impression of picking up in April. Probably will draw down even further in May and June. Is that it, Charlotte?
I think it's difficult to say, but definitely I would not say for certain that April is a sustainable trend towards growth. Actually, we are quite, again, this is positive to see a positive trend, but at EU Chamber we would be more cautious with this number.
All right, let's look at the figures first. According to the Customs Office, China's exports rebounded in April to rise 3.5% over a year earlier. Shipments to ASEAN rose 3.9% in the first 4 months of the year. However, exports to the EU dropped 6.6%, while to the US fell by a whopping 15.9%. So, Jake, did you expect this kind of drop between China and the US, and how did Americans feel about it?
I think that we were not expecting such a significant drop in the trade between the U.S. and China. Following the Phase 1 agreement between the U.S. and China, there was an expectation among many in the U.S. government and among many in industry that China would be purchasing more products from the United States, so those trade numbers might look a little bit better than they did. However, it's of course understandable. When we talked to our members on the ground, they noted that while in February and March, obviously factories were reopening in the China market, now that they've reopened, they're noticing a lack of supply of some products from Europe and the United States as those economies have slowed or shut down in some areas. So I think that these numbers, we're hopeful, are not a trend, but it may be a rough couple of months before they begin to rebalance.
But I was told the soybean export to China has been picking up. Is that it?
So we have to look at, depending on what the numbers are. Back, if we compare it to the 2017 numbers, they're a little bit lower than they were compared to that. Obviously, they're higher than they were last year because we were in the middle of a trade frictions between the U.S. and China. So there had been a significant reduction in soybean exports. So it all depends on the data that you look at. I would look at 2017 as more of a regular year of export growth. And obviously, we've seen an uptick from last year, which is positive. But probably not back to the normal levels we would expect in the past.
And also, Hong Hao, there is a discrepancy between import and export numbers. Interestingly, China export more, but import less. Why is that the case?
Well, I think because the domestic demand is falling fast, and also, you know, just now you mentioned that the transportation, the logistics between countries basically broken down as well. So, you know, I think, you know, for the month of March, you know, if you look at the retail sales figure, for example, you know, it's down, in many service industries, down more than half. And I think going into April is slightly better, but I think, you know, even so, you know, when the service industry coming back online, they're operating at about one-third to 2/3 of normal capacity. All right, so you're still talking about a significant reduction in domestic demand. And I think that's the reason why, you know, even though the export numbers look better than expected, but I think because of the domestic demand is weakening, so the importing number is worse than thought.
So it's going to be a bad cycle down the road because many factories in China are now facing rising inventory, falling profits, people losing their jobs, and cross-cutting efforts. How hard it will be for these factories and factory workers in the coming month?
Yeah, it's sort of the picture is improving. I mean, if you look at the economic numbers on the margin, right? So if you compare month-on-month or even weekly numbers, because we can now get higher frequency numbers, we see electricity generation is actually picking up. Also, coal consumption, for example, is up to 80 to 90% of normal level. And if you look at the traffic congestion data in the bigger cities, they're back to about 80% of the normal level as well. So I think, you know, even though there are difficulties ahead, but I think on the margin, things are actually improving from April.
But isn't it the bigger worry that the global demand is very problematic? Dongguan, that's a city of China's reform and opening up, has been known as the world's factory for being one of the largest manufacturing bases in the world. It probably makes a lot of electric appliances for many parts of this world, and now it is hard hit by the shrinking demand. And these could lead those factories into shutdowns and huge unemployment. Will that be happening?
Yeah, I would be surprised to see, you know, some of the factories that used to make orders only for foreign customers. They're probably gonna, you know, experience really significant hardship in the coming months. And already, you know, we're seeing, for example, shoe factories and apparel factories, you know, they're having some difficulties, you know, seeing overseas orders being cancelled. I think even before the virus outbreak, though, just to be fair, if you look at the trade numbers, since the 2018 trade war started, the global trade activity is actually declining. And also specifically regarding the relationship between U.S. and China, we're seeing the U.S. trade balance relative to China has been improving since 2018 very significantly, and also importing from China into the U.S. Has been declining dramatically as well. So I think with all that in mind, you're probably going to see, yes, you're right, some difficult months ahead.
So what's going to be the survival strategy for these manufacturers, these Chinese manufacturers? Let's take a look at what are some of the social media users been talking about China's industrial output. This Queasy1112 said, for those who say shifting export for domestic sales, I want to talk about the situation in my industry. I'm doing underwear businesses, and the domestic market is being saturated, and business is being hard. The company is being relying on export sales to support development. The impact of this pandemic is like a third world war. How can people stimulate domestic consumption without money? So her basic argument that is domestic demand will not be big enough to make up for the loss of foreign trade. Can those manufacturers turn to domestic market for some of the losses?
I would say it's very difficult. Yeah, I would say it's very difficult. I think because some of the factories actually survived and thrived used to be on foreign orders, right? So I think domestic demand, you have a separate sort of a set of supply chain to supply domestic demand. So I think those guys are probably doing okay, but I think for export orders that needs to be filled, they are disappearing. So I would say specifically for the export industries is having very difficult times. So if you look at, for example, right, so you can do a Baidu search, the key terms, if you search for, say, unemployment, so you see a surge in the search frequency in this term on the eastern seaboard and also on the southern seaboard, such as Guangzhou and the Guangdong province. So what that means is that traditionally these are the heartland for Chinese exports. They basically thrive on foreign orders, by exporting productions overseas. And now, because of the overseas demand is collapsing, that's why the search term of unemployment and looking for jobs is actually surging.
But the Chinese factories and also those factory workers have been well known for being resilient. What are the other options they have that they can survive in a way?
Well, we've seen these movies before in 2008, right? So I think that's the year when you see net exports contributed negatively to Chinese GDP growth. And back then, it's estimated that about 20 to 30 million migrant workers actually went back to their hometown. But I think in 2008, what's different is that, the Chinese economy is substantially smaller, and also the debt, the leverage ratio in the macroeconomy is substantially lower. So I think back then, even if you do a 4 trillion yuan stimulus, it's a very sizable stimulus. And back then, I still remember you have sending home appliances down to the second-tier city, encouraging people from rural area to buy cars and all that. But now it's very difficult to do all those stimulus again.
But do you think that the government should do the same thing, only on steroids this time, because the case is even more serious? Like boosting lending, providing rent subsidies, tax breaks, and giving coupons to people, and even cash.
Yeah, I think the government, the authority, is basically filling the stones as it cross the river, right? So I think if you look at today's monetary statistics, you see a dramatic surge of broad money into supply, back to close to 11%. We haven't seen that double-digit number for years and years. That is the highest number in the recent at least 4 years. So M2 tend to be a leading indicator of liquidity. So basically, for some reason, the government or the central bank and the commercial banks are starting to lend. So total social financing and also new loan growth in the system is actually better than expected. So those are the signs that there are helps, monetary helps from the authority. But whether you need bigger dose of those helps remains to be seen in the coming months.
Okay, Charlotte, what about the European response? Probably your economic makeup is different than the Chinese, but still the same problem.
Indeed, I think the major point in this crisis is, as you described a bit earlier, the decrease in global demand. So that's a huge concern, obviously. And then, actually, what I am representing are European companies in China. And the point for us is to really clarify that those companies are in China for China. So actually, they are quite resilient in that sense. I mean, they faced the crisis as Chinese companies
did. But are they also losing markets because of the pandemic?
I mean, back to normal operations. So that's they are hit by the pandemic, obviously, but in China, actually, they are, I would say, in a similar situation to other Chinese companies. So then it will very much depend on the sector in which they are working, because not all sectors are affected the same in this crisis. But the question is, how are they hit in their home countries? And for the moment, the pandemic is still ongoing in Europe. So we have seen shutdowns in some countries. It is going, I mean, countries are going out of this little by little. So we'll see. I mean, this month will be very interesting in this respect to see how the economy is recovering, how business is starting again, and how demand is growing again.
Jake, what about American businesses' sentiment towards the reopening of China and also the possible reopening of American economy? Will that further boost trade between the two?
Certainly reopening the U.S. economy would boost trade when it's closed at the moment. I think what we talk about frequently here in the United States is whether we'll have a V-shaped or a U-shaped recovery. V-shaped meaning that we would recover very quickly after we hit the bottom. U-shaped means we'd have a lower trough. And I think very few people in the United States now believe that a V-shaped recovery is possible. Much more likely we'll have a U-shape. So I think even though our member companies are beginning to reopen their U.S. manufacturing operations, some beginning May 1st, some this week, there's still going to be a long slog ahead before we get anything like a return to normalcy.
But you don't believe it is too optimistic, because there are also people in the States worried that maybe the reopening will worsen the epidemic control, probably a resurgence of this epidemic, and close again.
Yeah, this is a really challenging issue that I think is more political than business. Businesses are going to do what they can to ensure that their employees return to a safe work environment. That means taking the measures, wearing masks, social distancing, taking temperatures, ensuring that there's a safe work environment for them to return to. Ultimately, the calculus of whether or not we reopen now to restart the economy or hold and let the economy languish is one that I think the top officials in the United States are struggling with. But business is just trying to make sure that there's a safe reopening environment available to their employees.
What about the American businesses running in China? Are they fully open, and what is their market forecast?
So I would say that when we talk to our member companies, they're about 80%, 90% of their normal capacity. There are certainly some challenges to reopening because of the strict social distancing requirements. We talked to one member company who's in Wuhan, a big manufacturer. They noted that their employees don't go home every day. They go to a hotel. They're also required to each have their own individual bathroom that they can use. That obviously limits their ability to be able to operate at full manufacturing capacity. These sorts of environments are things that our companies are dealing with across the country. There's also challenges, of course, in logistics, which have already been discussed. Customs is overwhelmed with all the personal protective equipment exports, so that's challenging too. So there's a lot of different factors that are headwinds for business at the moment in the U.S. and China.
But we haven't seen massive layoff or even close down of American businesses. I mean, China.
Yeah, that's right. I think that's right. I think most of our companies have found ways to reduce their operations to ensure that they're able to retain the headcount they need. Luckily, we represent large multinational companies who tend to be a little bit more resilient in times of economic uncertainty. I think the smaller and medium-sized enterprises are probably struggling a little bit more than the large MNCs are.
And Hong Hao, this epidemic obviously has produced a huge shock to the global value chain, which is a long and complicated one. Will China's supply chain dominance remain intact because people worry about maybe overexposure to one country for manufacturing or value production is simply too risky?
Yeah, well, I think it is destined to change. I think in the past, the just-in-time, very linear sort of global supply chain, and now it's showing all of its weaknesses, at times like this. So I would say that, even after this, people probably want to have, two sets of systems, maybe have, even have some production domestic production as well. So I wouldn't be surprised to see that. And even before this virus outbreak, though, since 2018, since the trade war, the trade sort of disputes, basically, we're seeing some businesses are relocating because the cost of doing business in China, such as labor cost, has risen substantially, and also the land cost in some areas has becoming very unattainable. So because of the cost advantage is losing in China, so people actually relocated some of the sort of the lower end manufacturing business to other Southeastern Asian countries as well. So I would say the supply chain relocation is already happening. I think the virus outbreak is actually accelerating this process.
So the picture is that they would duplicate another chain outside China to have standby capacity, or simply move away from China altogether?
It's hard to say. I think the cost advantage is a big calculation here, but I wouldn't be surprised to see because in the past 20 years globalization has worked so well. I think the integration of China as a big global sort of a factory into the global supply chain actually suppressed global inflation pressure. So I think just imagine that now you have 2 or 3 supply chain system in place, and also
that will be very costly
China
to
out
have
of the
duplicate
system.
Capacity in different places.
That's right. That's exactly right. So I would say that would be a challenge, not just for China, but for the global system.
Especially when those transnational companies have to make their business decisions down the road in a 10-year or 20-year framework.
That's right.
And also trade was poised for a boost for Beijing and Washington because we removed the obstacles on trade restrictions to some extent because of the trade agreement signed. But that was set back when China shut down much of the economy to fight the virus outbreak. And forecasters warned that U.S. tariff hikes might be reimposed if the truce falls apart. So, Jake, do you worry about the trade agreement will fall apart because of this pandemic's impact on the economic transactions between two sides?
Yeah, it's a really challenging question. I just want to add one point to what Hong Hao said at the end.
Yeah.
We represent large U.S. multinational companies, and they make the point to us frequently that they're in China for China, and they see a significant proportion of global growth coming from China in the decade ahead. So they will continue to invest there. Agree with everything he said on supply chain resiliency, creating more redundancy in other markets, but our members are definitely in China for the long term. On your point about the trade agreement, as you know, the COVID-19 outbreak has become a political issue. It's no longer just a commercial or a business issue, and it's very much negatively impacted the bilateral relationship. I think our belief at the U.S.-China Business Council is that the Phase 1 agreement will stand. There's obviously been threats from the president over the last couple of days that China's purchase commitments aren't meeting the levels he would expect, but I would note that in the Phase 1 agreement, those targets are measured on an annual basis, and because of U.S. growing seasons, agriculture sales will likely happen in Q3 and Q4. We've obviously also seen a significant deterioration in global crude prices, which makes it much more difficult for those purchase volumes to occur in the levels that we would expect. Were the president to back out of the agreement, that would obviously have a very negative impact on some of his key stakeholders in the agricultural states. obviously the energy producers as well. So I think that the reality is that both sides need to come together and try to make the Phase 1 agreement work. I think what we've seen from the Chinese side to date is China's largely implemented on its commitments, particularly in the structural side. We've seen the financial service liberalization. We've seen an IP action plan released. We saw over the weekend that China's eliminated its QFII quotas. All of that's positive and going in the right direction. We just want to make sure that both sides give Phase 1 a chance so it doesn't go away unnecessarily.
But there were two things, Jake, that made put things derailed. One is, of course, the pandemic. Another is this is election year. Both parties wanting to win the competition will play the China bashing card and economic pressure on the other one. So this is very uncertain, unpredictable for your businesses to run the usual thing.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. If you look at the Pew Global Attitude Survey, it's been done every year annually since I think at least 2005. United States citizens have the highest level of unfavorable views towards China in, I think, the history of the study, 66%. Those views really matter because they influence how politicians react to issues. And I think another important issue we need to remember is that in the past, China's always been a fringe issue in U.S. elections. It's always been something that China could be beat up on by a politician, but it wasn't a core priority. This year, because of the COVID-19 outbreak and because the economy is in a very difficult situation domestically, China may be the core #1 central issue for both candidates. And
that won't be an easy one.
And it's not going to be a positive conversation. You're absolutely right. No one is going to be talking about the benefits of cooperative bilateral relations or trade with China. It's going to be how China stole factories from the United States. It's going to be starting the COVID-19 pandemic. Just really negative trends that may not be 100% truthful, but that have a lot of resonance politically, domestically within the United States.
And Charlotte, let's talk about the bigger picture. Many people are wondering when we will go back to normal. What kind of normal, we don't know. But how long do you think the slowdown will stay? And will we be ever coming back to business as usual?
It's obviously very difficult to say, as you mentioned. So it really depends on the sector, I would say. So if you look at the sectors that are most hardly hit, such as aviation or tourism, it is unlikely that they go back to their 2019 levels in the years to come, probably. So it will take some time. Logistics company would probably struggle also, as they will follow the pace of the global recovery. So obviously they are very busy now, but it's at the end of the day a business that is much related to the global trade, actually. What we observe is that for luxury goods, it could be relatively quick, and some of our European members saw this in fashion, cosmetics, luxury automobile. But for consumer goods that are dedicated to working or middle-class customers, it would take longer because obviously those customers are themselves hit. So actually it's a mixed picture. It's difficult to say. Not everything will go back to whatever normal it is at the same pace. And there will be definitely a reshaping. So I think it's quite difficult to say.
And Hong Hao,
I just wanted to mention, so sorry, because I was out of the show.
We understand there are some technical problems there.
Yeah,
and actually we're running out of time. Thank you very much. Thank you, Charlotte. Thank you, Hong Hao.
Yeah,
and thank you, Jake. You're watching Dialogue here on CGTN. I'm Joe in Beijing. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.